So, hello everybody. My name is Anna Shaginian, and I'm a founder of an educational project, Self-Carist. It's all about mental health and self-compassion, and we do a lot to make self-compassion known and practice here in Russia. And I'm also a teacher for the Mindful Self-Compassion program and a new mom, and I live with my family here in Russia, in St. Petersburg, with two of my lovely dogs. And today I'm talking to Kristin Neff, an associate professor at the University of Texas, Austin. And Kristin is a pioneer in the field of self-compassion and self-compassion research. And with Chris Germer, co-developer of the Mindful Self-Compassion program. She is an author of the book Self-Compassion, which is luckily already translated into Russian. And her new book, Fierce Self-Compassion, How Women Can Harness Kindness to Speak Up, Claim Their Power and Thrive, will be published in Russian shortly. So welcome, Kristin, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you, Anna, and thank you for your efforts to bring self-compassion to Russia. Everyone needs it.
Yes, thank you. And let's start with diving back into the early period of your self-compassion journey. You have been researching self-compassion for 20 years. Then the world was dominated by the ideas of high self-esteem and high ultra-positive motivational trainings.
Yes.
And also, there have not yet been hundreds of studies on the effectiveness of self-compassion. Although you did not invent compassion, you definitely brought the attention of the whole world to the importance of self-compassion. And I think this made a huge impact and a new turn in psychology and science, really. And also, I feel that in some way we are all pioneers in self-compassion when we start explore it and practice it, and especially when we don't meet much support. So my question is, do you remember how you felt in the very beginning? Did you have any doubts that it will work out, or you should better go and have some self-esteem training? What helped you to believe in yourself and the field of self-compassion?
Yeah, so I like to say self-compassion like sells itself, right? So I think I did contribute by helping to measure it and research, and now there's actually over 4,000 studies. But the message of self-compassion is kind of self-evident. If anyone just tries it out, starts being more kind and supportive to themselves, they can see, hey, this stuff works. So, I'm the messenger, but the message itself is what's so powerful about self-compassion. And so I learned it as a personal practice. I was actually learning mindfulness meditation in the tradition of Thich Nhat Hanh, who's one of the Buddhist teachers who talks a lot about self-compassion. And so I started practicing it, and I could see the value of it in my personal life. And I'd also done some work in self-concept development. I was learning about all the problems with self-esteem. Self-esteem itself is not a problem. It's good to feel worthy, but a lot of people get it through problematic ways like narcissism or putting other people down, or their self-esteem is contingent on, how do I look or do people like me, which isn't so healthy. So I got the idea when I got a job at the University of Texas at Austin that I wanted to research it. And I was a little nervous, and I didn't have tenure at that point. And I thought it might seem a little woo-woo, self-compassion. No one had really talked about it before. So I was a little nervous, but I got great advice from a mentor who said, Kristin, if you really are passionate about this, you'll do better research. You'll actually be more likely to get tenure, which worked out. And so I just kind of gave it a shot. I created a scale to measure it. I hadn't really had a lot of experience, but I just tried it and started doing research, and it just really worked. And now it's got a life of its own. There's probably about 10 new studies that come out every day. I can't keep up with the field. There's so much research being done. It's just remarkable.
Yeah, you have been practicing fierce self-compassion from the very, very beginning, I guess. Yeah, and then also curious, what was yeah, go ahead.
Well, no, did you want to ask about fierce self-compassion? Yeah.
Yes. No, I will ask.
Okay.
will ask a little bit later. I
Okay,
just was
why don't
curious.
you re-ask your question? Yeah, okay.
Yeah. What was the most surprising thing that you found through your research?
Um, well, a few things. One, I suppose, is that it's actually not very difficult to help people be more self-compassionate, right? Even though our culture doesn't support it, even though I would say most of us, most people are about average in self-compassion. They aren't really hard on themselves, but they aren't really actively kind and supportive either. But you can very easily get people in a compassionate frame of mind just by having them use what I've defined as the three components of self-compassion. Write a paragraph being mindful, just acknowledging this is hard. Write a paragraph reminding yourself that you aren't alone. This is part of the human experience. There's nothing wrong with you for struggling. And then some words of kindness, like you would say to a good friend. And the reason I think it's not as hard as I thought it would be is because we already, most of us at least, already know how to be compassionate to others, right? To our friends, to our family members, to those we care about. So it's not like we've got to create something new. It's not like we're developing a brand new skill. What we're doing is just giving ourselves permission to use the skill we've already developed for ourselves. And that was good news. I didn't realize that at first. And by the
Yeah.
way, so that's related to another surprising finding is that I thought that people who are naturally more self-compassionate would also be naturally more compassionate to others.
Mm.
But it's not the case just because there's so many people who are naturally compassionate to others who treat themselves horribly. So even
Yeah.
though when you gain in self-compassion, you grow in your ability to be compassionate to others, but they don't necessarily go hand in hand because so many people like lead these split lives. They're very kind and caring to others, and they treat themselves horribly. So all really self-compassion is doing is getting them into alignment so that you're also compassionate to yourself.
Yeah, I think that some misconceptions and fears about being compassionate to yourself
Yes.
play a huge role here.
Yeah. Big
Yeah.
cultural barriers. Oh, that's another surprising thing. They seem to be worldwide. The same fears and myths about self-compassion come up. Doesn't matter if it's in Russia or Japan or China or Australia or South America. For whatever
Yeah. I
reason,
just,
over and over again, they have the same fears of self-compassion, which is kind of strange, but it seems to be true.
yeah. And actually, when I started my first MSc program back in 2018 in London, I had a strong belief that self-compassion is alien for Russian mentality because of our socio-political structure for the past century, and that people tend to downplay their needs and not express their emotions fully and have lack of trust. In addition, I thought that there is an attitude to children filled with normalized physical punishment, emotional abuse, and disrespect of children's rights. But years of practice and teaching mindful self-compassion proved me wrong. And now I think that it's not all black and white, and each country and society has its own issues and
Yes.
ways we solve them, and still we have a lot in common. And what do you think influences probably a particular culture or society to cultivate compassion among people?
Yeah, so and it is true. It's not like it's exactly the same. Some cultures are more the idea of compassion itself is encouraged more than others, right? It's part of the fabric. Um, yeah, it's interesting to think about what might lead a particular culture to have blocks. So, for instance, one cross-cultural study we found was that people in Thailand are much more self-compassionate than people in Taiwan, right? They're both Asian cultures, but in Taiwan, there's a real kind of achievement mentality, and people really buy into the idea that being self-critical is going to help them achieve, even though the research shows that actually doesn't, that being self-compassionate is going to be more supportive
Yeah.
in achieving your goals, but people don't realize that. Whereas in Thailand, it's not such an achievement-oriented culture, and Buddhism, the idea of kind of spiritual well-being is just a bigger part of the culture, and people have a little more relaxed attitude about things. So some of that may play into it. It's interesting to think about. I don't know the answer to that, but
Yeah.
there are cultural variations in beliefs and fears, and yet everywhere I go, people assume it's going to undermine your motivation when the research shows clearly it enhances your motivation. It just
Yeah,
changes. Yeah, switches the motivation from fear, I better achieve or else I'm inadequate, to care. I want to achieve because I want to achieve my goals and I care about myself. The last one's actually more effective.
I actually wanted to ask to talk a little bit more about this, because there are recent studies, especially in sports and academic environment, which shows that motivation with self-compassion is much, much more effective.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say it's much, much more effective. I mean, I would like to be able to say that. It's not much, it's more easy to maintain, right? So here's the thing, self-criticism works in the short term. It's kind of like physical punishment with children. It works in the short term to get them to comply. But in the long term, it undermines children because they don't have that self-confidence, they don't feel supported. And in the long term, it's going to cause mental health issues. Well, it's kind of the same with self-criticism. In the short term, it may work. You may study for your exam or achieve your goals, but it's actually going to create performance anxiety, fear of failure, and maybe even depression, procrastination, things that are going to harm you in the long run. So what we know about self-compassionate motivation, so for instance, I have a dissertation student who works with athletes, high-level collegiate athletes, and they ate it up because they could see immediately that what self-compassion gave them that self-criticism didn't, was in the middle of the game, if you fail, you make a mistake. If you derail yourself with self-criticism, it actually undermines your ability to recover from that mistake, right? You're full of anxiety, you think about yourself, you kind of withdraw. It's actually not good for your game. But saying, okay, everyone makes mistakes. Okay, what can I learn from it? And it allows you to keep going in a way that's actually more effective. So it is more effective, especially in the long run. But again, if self-criticism didn't work at all, people probably wouldn't do it. Just like spanking your children, kind of works, but causes a lot of problems. You know?
Yeah, the price of side effect is too expensive.
Yes.
Yeah. And let's move forward to fears. My lovely topic, actually, and talk about your new book. It will be very soon published in Russian, and congratulations to all of us. Really, I'm very happy it's happening, and it's really meaningful and inspiring book. And it's all about fierce self-compassion, which help us to set boundaries, speak out loud, and live a meaningful life. Would you please talk a little bit more about the difference between tender self-compassion and fierce self-compassion according to your three-component model?
Yeah. So my three-component model, right, is just that we need mindfulness to turn toward the pain, common humanity, recognize that we aren't alone, we're part of being human, and kindness, but at least really support. And this can take different forms. People, almost always assume it's the gentle form, that it's about accepting yourself, it's about that warm, nurturing quality. And that is a part of compassion, but it's not the only way compassion looks. Compassion also means taking action to alleviate suffering. Think of a firefighter jumping into a burning building to save people. It takes bravery, it takes courage, it takes action. It also takes doing something to try to change the situations that are causing harm. So tender self-compassion is more about accepting yourself, right, with warmth, kind of that gentle, nurturing energy, kind of like a mothering type of energy. And fierce self-compassion means even though you accept yourself, you don't necessarily accept all your behaviors if they're harmful. And you certainly don't accept the way other people are treating you or situations you're in if they're harmful, right? So sometimes we also need to take action. And I like to call this mama bear self-compassion. I don't know if in Russia you've got the idea of mama bear, but so if you want to see someone fierce, you try, harming mama bear's children. And in some ways, we're like our own children, and we tap into that fierce protective energy. And that's what allows us to say no, to draw boundaries, to meet our own needs, right? So, my book is actually written for women in particular, because women are socialized to be tender, but not to be fierce. We can be fierce to protect our children, but not ourselves. People don't like it if we're too active. They don't like it if we're too competent. They don't like it if we get angry. People like us to be self-sacrificing, to not focus on ourselves or our own needs, or to achieve things as much. And so for women, it's we have to really consciously choose to allow ourselves to be fierce, to get angry if we need to. I mean, the Me Too movement, I don't know how that's transpired in Russia, but in the United States, the Me Too movement, when women finally have risen up and said, you cannot sexually harass me anymore. That's not okay. That's a self-compassion movement. You know, we're actually standing up and saying, you cannot cause me harm. This comes from the heart of compassion, the alleviation of suffering. But I mean, men also need both fierce and tender. Men are actually prevented from being tender. They're socialized, where they're called names or picked on if they're too sensitive. Everyone is harmed by the split between fierceness and tenderness. We all need to integrate it. But you might say the blocks are a little bit different for people socialized as, by the way, I'm not talking about biological sex, just gender role socialization that leads to these patterns.
Yeah, we definitely need cocktail of all these aspects.
It's like yin and yang. We need balance, right, to be whole. But unfortunately, society doesn't allow us to be balanced. So we kind of, again, that's what you said, it's a radical act. Self-compassion is a radical act. It's saying, maybe you won't like me if I draw a boundary. I'm sorry you don't like me, but I'm going to draw this boundary nonetheless because I care about myself. And this is an important need. It's not like we say we're more important than others, but we're as important as others. We don't exclude ourselves from the equation. And by the way, historically, women have been socialized to be self-sacrificing because people in power, don't they love it if women, of course, I'm going to give up my needs and I'm just going to focus on supporting my husband and my children. Who does that serve? That serves people in power. So we really have to question this and say, is this right? Is it fair? Does it actually meet my needs as well? You know, and the more we meet our own needs, it's not selfish, because the more we meet our own needs, the more resources we have available to give to others. It's not like it takes away from you. It actually adds to what I can give because I'm replenishing myself by meeting my own needs.
Right, absolutely. I agree with you. And thank you for explaining this idea so clearly, because sometimes people tend to think of self-compassion as something only tender, only supportive in this kind and soft way. And actually, Mama Bear is my favorite metaphor for fierce self-compassion, because after having my first baby 2 years ago, I realized how strong and powerful my Mama Bear is. And sometimes she's overreacting or she's too fierce, and I'm only trying to live with her, but still I love this part with all my heart. And also I find parenting like, you know, an unstoppable balance between tender compassion and fierce compassion. And this, you know, mix of soft and support, love, and it is mixed with desire to fiercely protect. All these feelings have been related to my child.
Well, and they're very similar. So really what we're kind of doing with self-compassion is we're parenting ourselves, you know, and we kind of understand it with our children, that we need to draw boundaries, we need to protect them. We also need to be there for them to accept them. And so it's the same thing with ourselves, right? Because our parents, you know, some of us didn't have good parents or supportive parents, or maybe our parent, well, as adults, we kind of need to start doing for ourselves what our parents did for us. And that comes in the form of self-compassion, both fierce and tender.
Yeah, this really resonates a lot with me. And along these lines, I love that you don't pretend to be the most non-reactive person in the world. And
no, and if you met my mother, you'd understand it runs into our genes, you know. And partly that's why I wrote my book. You know, people think I'm a mindfulness and compassion teacher. Then I'm like, all soft, gentle. And that's not my nature. I'm more yang than yin, actually, you might say. And for years, I kind of struggled with it. I could accept my anger. I didn't judge myself for it, especially after self-compassion practice. But it wasn't really until it dropped for me that same fierce energy that may lead me to sometimes be overreactive. By the way, you know, and of course I try to work on it. I don't want to harm anyone else, but that same fierce energy was precisely what allowed me to accomplish what I've accomplished in my life, and that I wouldn't trade it for anything. it's not a bad part of me. Sometimes it gets a little out of hand and I need to rein it in. But I actually bought a picture of the Hindu goddess Kali and put it on my wall and said, thank you for this
Yeah.
energy, because this is like a volcanic energy that's a real power source that we shouldn't overlook. And women have been denied access to that power source, partly to keep us in our place. And so, part of waking up and saying no to social injustice and sexism is saying, you're not going to keep me from my power source. It's within me.
Yeah.
If you don't
And I'm
like
also
it, tough tooties. I can say that. I don't know how you're going to translate into Russian, Anna, tough tooties, but yeah.
I'll do my best. Yeah, actually, this supports a lot, really, because talking about parenting, here in Russia, I feel big pressure on women in this parenting sphere. And probably you also notice that women are judged by how good they are at parenting more often than men.
Yes.
So,
yeah.
Do you have any observations on that?
Yeah, well, it's really tough for women. I mean, that's why I wrote my book for women, because we're also in a double bind, right? So we need to be these perfect parents and nurturing and gentle and kind and supportive.
Yes.
We are allowed more in the workplace, right? But the research shows, and I'm sure it's still the same in Russia, people like soft, nurturing women. But to succeed in the workplace, you need to be fierce and tough. But people don't like fierce and tough women. So for women who succeed in the workplace, it comes at the expense of being liked. And being disliked by those in power can keep you down. It can cause problems, right? People don't promote people they don't like, or they don't pay them as much. And so there's a lot more pressure on women. And that's why a fierce compassion is also aimed outward, not just inward, right? So we can do a lot with ourselves, claiming our authenticity, not buying into these negative sexist messages. But we also need to change the system as much as we can. We need to actually work on saying, this isn't okay. We need to change the culture. And by the way, that's a big task, I know, but it's not just an inside job. We also have to try to work to change the way people talk about these things, the way they think about things, the way organizations are run. And it's a slow process. I think it's starting to happen slowly, but it is at least moving in that direction, at least in the United States. I'm not sure how things are in Russia, but
I can also feel it here. I think things start to change, and we definitely need those discussions and talks on how to be fierce. And actually, my next question is all about this, because when we fight for our rights,
yes,
how can we still stay compassionate and don't create more suffering in the world? Because I'm thinking a lot about this. How can we teach a new parenting model without shaming people? Or here in Russia, we still don't have the law against domestic violence. And how can, yes, that's incredible, but it's still true. And how can we fight for the law to protect women from domestic violence without being violent to those who are in patriarchal relationship? Because violence breeds violence, and we definitely don't need more to happen. In other words, how can we practice self-compassion without multiplying aggression? What do you think?
Yeah, well, so luckily, I mean, I think we do have models. There have been nonviolent social change movements, like look at Mahatma Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr., or, people who've made big change in the world. The key seems to be to separate the person from the behavior. So you can say the behavior of domestic abuse is wrong. It needs to stop. It can't happen. But you don't have to hate the person doing it. Right? Because the person doing it has their own history and the whole reason they're doing it and their issues and the way they were raised, and they may be unconscious and all those things. So, like Martin Luther King talked about this with people who are racist. You can hate racism, but you don't have to hate the racist, the person doing it, because again, you can have compassion and understanding for the fact that they're human beings raised in a system that's way bigger than they are. Right?
Yeah.
So it's you just keep the focus on the behavior as opposed to people. And it's kind of like fierce and tender self-compassion. Fierce compassion is aimed at behavior and situations, but the tender self-compassion is kind of unconditionally accepting of human beings and their intrinsic worth. And by the way, it's hard to draw the line, and we're going to mess up. And maybe you think you aren't harming the person, and they're going to take it personally, and they're going to feel harmed. So it's a very messy process. I don't want to pretend that it's not, but that seems to be the basic thing. So in other words, the whole issue is this causing harm or not? So if you're attacking a person, you're causing harm. If you're saying harmful behavior needs to stop, you're preventing harm.
Yeah. I also think that self-compassion could also help to prevent and stop harming behavior, because it reduces shame and all that strong emotions which could have arise.
Absolutely. I think shame, yes, so self-compassion is kind of a direct antidote to shame. We don't feel so alone. We don't judge ourselves. We're mindful, as opposed to being like stuck in our shameful thoughts. And a lot of violence comes out of shame, and a lot of reactivity. So yeah, I do think it helps.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I love that perspective of thinking about some issues we have and not trying to harm people who do these actions, because of course problem is not in these people, the actions are just wrong.
Right.
And I also wanted to talk with you about one more interesting topic I'm curious about last month. You did a tremendous job working on your last book, and you were going deep into women rights issues. Did you feel your attitude to women change? I'm asking because being socialized as women, even when we understand all the tricks of patriarchy society, we can still feel inner misogyny towards others or towards ourselves.
Yeah.
And did something arise while you were in the process?
Well, I mean, I think the process happened even before I started writing the book, which is partly why I wrote the book, for people who identify. And it's actually, I shouldn't say it's people who identify as women, it's people who are socialized as women, right? So for people who are socialized as women, I really wrote this book for them, partly because I had been familiar with inner misogyny. So I write about in the book about my experience at UT Austin, right? Which is, and by the way, still going on. I just retired, and they didn't give me emeritus status. Emeritus status means that it's kind of like, it's everyone who had applied for it before received it. I've objectively achieved a great deal, and they just didn't think I was a good citizen, which is probably substitute for maybe I wasn't nurturing or met the ideal of a good woman. What a good woman citizen looks like is different than a good man citizen. So I know it played a role in this. And women who part of this made the decision. So I do understand that women, all this is unconscious, right? And I have had to try to check, really consciously. Same with race and sex and any prejudice. These are unconscious. So you really need to stop and ask yourself, what is it that's driving me to perceive the way I do, and what is it that are driving other people to have the perceptions they do? So instead of making it personal, like those, calling them names, is like kind of seeing how this all arises out of a system that's larger than any one individual.
Yeah.
So I think I did feel it allowed me to feel more connected to women and the struggle of women, and to really start seeing it everywhere. I mean, gender is the first discriminatory category that people learn, right? People start discriminating based on gender even before a child is born, once they know the sex of the child. It's the earliest form of discrimination. Ideas about what this baby is going to be like, what they're going to accomplish, what their interests will be. So in some ways, it's like the core form of discrimination. Not that the other forms aren't important, they are, but like, we can't address racism without addressing sexism. We also need the reverse is also true. They're all intertwined, but sexism is so pervasive. It just shapes, even, I don't know in Russia if they have gendered nouns, but in a lot of languages they do, like Spanish and French. even that changes things. I mean, it's one of our core biases. And we really need to start trying to make these conscious so we don't fall victim to them.
Yeah, that's tough even to realize that sometimes you may still be in all these tricks, but it's absolutely a system thing which couldn't be changed by one person, and it's not the fault of one particular person.
Right. It's not our fault, but it is our responsibility in the sense that once we kind of are aware of it, we do have a responsibility to try not to continue to cause harm by perpetrating it or perpetuating it, maybe is a better word.
Yeah. And why do you think women more often visit self-compassion program?
Well, yeah, I mean, so this is really interesting, right? So 85% of the people that come to my programs are women, even though women have a little less self-compassion than men. The reason they have less self-compassion is because they feel less entitled to meet their own needs. But they also are more aware of the value of compassion because they're raised to be compassion experts for others. And I think for men, compassion is a female thing. Self is a female thing. Self-awareness is a female thing. And the whole thing is like, they think it's weak. They think it's woo-woo. Men do. They don't see it as something relevant to them, which harms men. Because, for instance, we have research with combat veterans, most of whom were men, not all, but most of whom were men, who were more self-compassionate. They were less likely to commit suicide. They were less likely to develop post-traumatic stress syndrome or to abuse alcohol. The barrier for men, against practicing self-compassion, because it's a weak female thing, directly harms men's ability to be strong in the face of adversity. And it's really a tragedy. But, probably other men are going to need to change that one because men aren't going to listen to me about that.
And thanks to Steve Hickman, who is already making his program for men. And I think it's really effective to feel yourself in a safe environment to be with other men.
Yeah.
One more, and probably the last thing I wanted to ask you is that I often notice that people who start practicing self-compassion at some point start criticizing themselves for being not compassionate enough, or for self-criticism. And at these moments, I always tell them, there is nothing wrong with you facing self-criticism. And it's important how we react to these messages and how we support ourselves then. And you can practice self-compassion for years and still have some self-critical thoughts from time to time. But you will have more resources and allow the compassionate voice to answer back. Even Kristin Neff might sometime criticize herself. So, Kristin, my last question is, what for does Kristin Neff can criticize herself automatically these days?
So quite honestly, I don't criticize myself, but shame does arise. Right? So a lot of these feelings are biological in origin, they're evolutionary. So some of these feelings to turn inward when we feel threatened in some way are very natural. So self-criticism is more of the fight response. You beat yourself up thinking you control yourself. I really don't do that very often. And I actually was never that self-critical as a personality trait. And so now if I make a mistake, I don't call myself names. But I still feel shame. Shame arises, right? Shame, that feeling of like, oh, again. And like that feeling of wanting to hang your head and like just kind of that hollow feeling that goes throughout your body. So it still comes up. Again, I think it's a natural, evolved part of our response. Evolutionarily, people who felt shame when they broke group norms were less likely to, continue in the group. They removed themselves, and it didn't harm the group, things like that. So I just give myself, but I pretty darn quickly give myself compassion for my shame. It's pretty intuitive now. But remember that compassion isn't about getting it right. It's about opening your heart. So do I still make mistakes and get it wrong and get reactive and constantly? I mean, I've maybe changed a little bit, but incredibly small amount, much less than I might like. But I have, and I talk about this, I become a compassionate mess. I'm still a mess, but it can start to be a habit to hold that mess with compassion. So it doesn't take me very long to remember. And again, sometimes like this whole issue with not getting emeritus status, it was so overwhelming because it had a lot of negative consequences for like my work life. It took me a while to remember self-compassion. It took me a couple of days because I was so like caught up with, well, what does this mean? And this is so unfair. And I wasn't beating myself up, but I was lost in it.
Yeah.
But then I actually soften, soothe, allow as my go-to practice. I felt it in the body, put my hands on. I remember that I wasn't alone. Things like this happen to people. It's part of life. And I gave myself kindness and I helped process the difficult emotions that way.
Yeah. Messy compassion.
Messy compassion. And then, so I am a compassionate mess. I'm a mess, but I'm usually compassionate. I mean, so in other words, it can become a habit, giving yourself compassion, but some of those feelings of shame and certainly making mistakes, there's no avoiding that from at least my experience. Yeah.
Practice never ends, I guess.
Yeah. Well, it's a process. It's not like you get there and you're done.
Sure.
It's continual. And then that's where you have to remind yourself and you have to do it again and get back up on that horse again, but you keep getting backed off your entire life. And that's just because we're human beings. We're imperfect human beings, you know? Yeah. So.
Oh, thank you so much, Kristin. It was such a huge pleasure for me to talk to you. And I'm so grateful for your incredible input to make this world a better place to live, but still messy place to live with more compassion here. So thank you very much. And I can't wait your new book to come and we can touch it and read it in paper.
Great.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Anna. I appreciate it. It's been fun. Thank you.
Thank you.